Hey guys, and welcome to the ACT Science Conflicting Viewpoints video. So conflicting viewpoints passages account for only 1 out of every 7 passages on the science test. They're not as prevalent as the other 2 types, but they're still important. So if you can get the conflicting viewpoints passage right, then you have anywhere from 5 to 7 questions that you've already answered. So the idea with conflicting viewpoints is that unlike the other sections where you're going to be looking at experiments and you're looking at, tables, research, data, that sort of thing, in this one you're reading paragraphs. Occasionally you will actually see a table within a conflicting viewpoints. It doesn't happen very often, but for the most part what it is 2 or possibly 3 people. Again, 3 is pretty rare. 2 or 3 people talking about their positions. So generally, what you're going to see is you're going to have a first paragraph, and the first paragraph is not either person's stated position, but it tends to be some background information, and it kind of sets you up for what the main topic of the entire passage is going to be. So, it's like background info. And this is where you'll figure out, oh, we're going to be talking about the reasons that this phenomena happens. So once you read the first paragraph or the first section, the second part should be scientist 1, researcher 1, student 1, etc. So you'll have a first paragraph, and then you'll have the first person, and they'll give their ideas, their opinion, and then you have a second person, potentially a third person, but it doesn't happen very often. So first person's opinion, basically, and then second person's opinion. So they tend to be in 3 parts. Very occasionally you won't have a first paragraph at all, or rather your first paragraph will actually be the paragraph with your first person talking. But most of the time you get a background information paragraph or paragraphs, then the first person paragraph or paragraphs, and then the second person, occasionally a third. So the idea with the conflicting viewpoints is that you're supposed to figure out what is the take that the 2 people have on a certain topic. So most of the time with the science passages, what you're going to be dealing with is something like a phenomenon, and then the first person is going to say why they think that this phenomenon takes place, and then the second person is going to say why they think the phenomenon takes place. And the 2 people rarely agree with each other. Occasionally they have some kind of common ground that they share, but they're never going to both have the same opinion, otherwise it wouldn't be conflicting viewpoints. So you're always going to have 2 different takes on a certain idea. And they're normally 2 different explanations for something occurring. AKA, why do we yawn? Or how do certain, diseases come about? Nature versus nurture, all of that good stuff. So you're always going to have 2 or 3 people kind of arguing over a topic. So that's the basic idea. Now, conflicting viewpoints questions can ask about a number of different things. So let's go ahead and go over those now. So the most simple of conflicting viewpoints questions are basically opinion questions. So an opinion question is basically just going to ask you what is passage 1 or author 1's main opinion, what is author 2's main opinion, that sort of thing. So that's pretty straightforward. It's just, what the main idea of both people is. And that shouldn't be too hard to identify either, because they want you to be able to identify that so that you can then deal with more, complicated ideas. The next is talking about evidence. So they can ask you, what was the best evidence that supports the opinion? So this is generally evidence that is found in the passage itself, and it's part of the main argument that they're giving. So, okay, again, sometimes the pen just sticks and doesn't write things. So again, like the evidence and the opinion questions are just your ability to read the argument and understand what they're talking about. So not anything outside of the passage yet. Okay, then the next thing is they can ask you about the differences. So they either do this by saying, you know, which of the following would passage 1 author agree with but passage 2 author disagree with, which, you know, you just have to keep track of what they're trying to ask. Or they could say, you know, which of the following or what do the 2 authors not agree on. But however they word it, it's all about just difference of opinion. So, difference of opinion. So that's like, you know, a compare and contrast sort of question. They can also ask about what similarities they have. So what do they both agree on? Okay, similarities. This seems like something really obvious and simple right now when we're talking about it. We don't have a passage in front of us. However, most of the time, the authors don't really agree on very much. So similarities tend to be something like they both make a common assumption. Or, you know, they both define the topic as the following. So if you can't find a similarity at all within the 2 passages between the 2 authors, what you do is you look in that first paragraph, because the way it works out is that the first paragraph is everything that they agree on, and then the next paragraphs are what their own personal take on the argument is. So when in doubt, look at the first paragraph. Okay, so this is where it starts getting a little bit more difficult, when you have to look in the first paragraph and try to figure it out. The next thing is one of the harder types, which is they'll give you different pieces of information that are not in the passage, and they'll ask you, you know, which of the following, if true, would strengthen or would weaken the argument of, and they can say, you know, both authors or just author 1, just author 2, etc. Okay, and the last type of question that is just a conflicting viewpoint sort of question is where they will give you some information and then they will ask you how the scientists would interpret that information. So basically, what you're doing is you're using the evidence or the position that's stated in the passage in order to try to kind of get in the shoes of the author and figure out what they would think. It's a lot like actually an inference question when we're looking at the reading section. So it's that same kind of idea. You're going to use those same skills. So interpreting outside info. Okay. So, in addition to these, which are just conflicting viewpoint sorts of questions, you're also going to have some of the same kinds of questions that you had earlier. So, for instance, you don't really have too much scientific reasoning unless they have an experiment, which they normally don't. But you could be asked to actually model data that they use. So you will have some limited amount of like patterns and trends sorts of questions. So they can also, you know, ask you to model data or kind of explain theories with some sort of, you know, picture, figure, etc. So with figure. So those are the same sorts of questions that you are, or at this point, are used to doing with things like data representation and research summary, but they kind of put a spin on it in that they don't give you numbers, they'll just explain something, and then you're meant to figure out, you know, if I were to turn that into some sort of figure, some sort of visual representation, how would that look exactly? So For the most part, these are totally different from the other two types of passages, but there is a little bit of overlap between the two, which is a nice thing. So this one is mostly testing your ability to kind of understand an argument and also to apply that knowledge to outside things. So it's your, when you're looking at your additional evidence or you're interpreting outside information, that's kind of going to be where the difficulty of this sort of passage lies. Okay, so now that we've covered the types of questions that you will encounter when looking at conflicting viewpoints, let's go ahead and go over the method for them.